Economists they have a method. I'm a fanatical simplifier.
I think the most important thing about Paul's work is the way that he works. You really have to understand how good someone has to be so simple.
Paul Krugman, this year's winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, lives in Princeton, New Jersey with his wife Robin Wells, who is also an economist. Krugman was awarded the prize primarily for his work on international trade and economic geography. For Krugman, a simple walk down Main Street reveals a complex set of trade relationships.
First of all, just how much trade there is. I mean, it's just awesome how integrated the world is.
Since the late 1970s, Krugman has produced a series of bold ideas that have changed the way economists look at the world.
In a way, economic theory, international trade theory, can be dated before Paul Krugman and after Paul Krugman.
In 1979, Krugman published an innovative analysis of international trade that would come to be known as the New Economics, or New Trade Theory.
Circa 1978 or so, the theory of international trade, the one that everybody was in the textbooks, and even the way that economists talk to each other, was entirely a theory about trade between countries that takes place because the countries are different. You're relatively good at producing wine, I'm relatively good at producing wheat, so we exchange wheat for wine.
It's an idea called comparative advantage, and it was the accepted wisdom. The problem for Krugman was that it didn't reflect the real world of international trade.
And it did not explain why there was so much trade between countries that were quite similar. It did not explain why there was so much trade inside Western Europe, why there was so much trade between the United States and Canada.
Why, for example, would countries like France, Germany, Sweden, and even Japan, economically similar and lacking a comparative advantage with each other, all build cars and trade with each other?
His work provided at least part of the answer to that question, and in doing so, revolutionized our thinking about international trade.
Key to his approach are economies of scale.
If you increase the amount of stuff you produce, the costs don't rise in proportion. Double the scale of production, your costs won't double.
That means that once you're in the business of producing something, anything, you can produce extra at relatively low cost. And you'll likely sell it to markets similar to your own because what the marketplace really wants is choice.
It helps explain why the cookie aisle in your supermarket has got cookies from Denmark and cookies from Britain and cookies from the United States. You know, that's something that wouldn't seem to make sense in terms of the old theory, but actually people do benefit from variety.
It works for cookies, cars, and other consumer products. But it also works for machine tools, steel, and virtually anything else that can be traded.
And once there's this variety, then add in the economies of scale, and you're going to find that different countries are going to produce different varieties, and you're going to get all of this trade.
So that's an example of his attempt to sort of look at real-world problems, think about the way in which traditional economic theory doesn't work, and then try to find some very simple models.
The modeling is harder than you might imagine. They tend to look quite simple at the end, but they look simple because you found a clear way of looking at it.
Krugman's work on international trade led him to think about economic geography.
The question then is, well, why is stuff where it is?
Economic geography can help to explain why populations gather in certain places.
I want to produce stuff where the market is large. People want to move where stuff is being produced. You can get these circular processes where a region that has got head start ends up building upon that head start. We're sitting here sort of dead center in the 60 million people crammed into a narrow stretch of the East Coast. Why are we here? And the answer is not because the scenery is beautiful, but because the other 60 million people are there.
You can say that makes common sense, but until you start thinking about it, and thinking about it rigorously, common sense is very uncommon.
My relatives who really didn't know what I'd been doing when they saw the prize being announced. They said, "But isn't that obvious?" And I said, "Well, it took a lot of work to make it obvious."
Krugman's desire to explain the world in clear terms led him to write about economics for a popular audience. That led to an opinion column in the New York Times, where he became a harsh and persistent critic of the American administration. He was so critical that Newsweek magazine called him extremely grumpy.
Well, yes, I have been grumpy, and why not? Well, from my point of view, we had an administration that lied about its tax policies, lied about its spending policies, and lied us into war. So why should I be cheerful about all that? We're doing portfolio.
When Krugman learned that he had been awarded the Nobel Prize, he was in a hotel in Washington, D.C.
My cell phone rang. Literally, I was about to step into the shower, so I took the news stark naked. My first thought was, this is obviously a fake Swedish accent, and it's a practical joke, and I wonder which of my friends has done this. Someone wrote about some composer, that he was able to compose songs that sound like nobody wrote them. And sometimes I feel like what I try to do on economics, I try to write models that sound like nobody actually had to model them.